The radio tower crackled with warnings at 0530 hours. Flash flood advisories, crosswinds above 70 knots, 0 successful landings in the past 12 hours. But inside the operations tent at Riverside Emergency Airfield, Colonel Marcus Brennan acted like the weather was just another minor inconvenience to be managed with proper planning and expensive equipment. Becca Torres stood at the edge of the briefing circle, her weathered flight cap pulled low against the morning glare streaming through the tent flaps. Her clipboard held a hand-drawn map of the coastal region, pencil lines tracing elevations and water patterns she'd observed over 15 years of flying these routes. The paper was already damp at the corners from the humid air, but every mark on it was earned through experience, not downloaded from a satellite. First wave departs at 0900, Brennan announced, his voice carrying the crisp authority of someone who'd never doubted his own decisions. 3 flight groups, 5 aircraft each. Primary drops begin over Sector Delta. He gestured toward a pristine digital overlay pinned to the corkboard, its GPS coordinates and color-coded zones looking impressively official. Around him, heads nodded in practiced rhythm. Styluses tapped across tablet screens. The assembled pilots wore matching flight suits with corporate sponsor patches, their gear clean and camera-ready. At the center of the group stood Captain Derek Manning, young and confident, his smile as polished as the twin-engine turboprop gleaming behind him. "Press crew's riding with us," Derek said, gesturing toward his aircraft with obvious pride. "Full communication setup, dual camera feeds. We'll be wheels up just before sunrise to catch that perfect ridge lighting for the media package." A scattered chorus of approval rippled through the group. Someone from logistics gave an enthusiastic thumbs up. The French liaison, hidden behind wraparound sunglasses, murmured something appreciative to his translator. Near the supply crates, a woman with a media badge adjusted her camera lens and spoke loud, enough for everyone to hear. "Let's make sure our visuals aren't blocked by any non-essential aircraft during rollout." Her eyes swept past Becca without acknowledgement, but the message landed clearly enough. Becca stepped forward, her movement deliberate but quiet. "The coast bends here," she said, tapping a specific point on her hand-drawn map. "The channel. Between the low ridges, it's still passable by shallow draft if the wind shifts. But you'll need to drop south, not east." Colonel Brennan didn't look at her directly. "Let's stick to approved navigation systems, please." Derek's eyes flicked down to Becca's clipboard, then back up with barely concealed amusement. "Hand-drawn charts? Did you get those from the visitor center gift shop?" Becca didn't rise to the bait. She held out the map again, her voice steady. "This is based on last season's storm patterns. The post-cyclone breakwater moved inland by 20 feet. The satellite imagery you're using is 6 months old. Who logged that change?" Brennan asked, still without looking directly at her. "I did." The silence that followed felt heavier than the humid morning air. Someone near the fuel station coughed into their sleeve. A radio chirped briefly, its static filling the awkward pause before cutting out. Brennan glanced toward one of his junior officers. "Is she on today's roster?" The officer checked his clipboard with theatrical precision. "No, sir. She's ground listed. No manifest slot assigned." Derek chuckled, the sound carrying just enough volume to ensure everyone heard. "Guess we've got extra eyes on deck." "Maybe. She can hang around for moral support." The media coordinator swept her hand in a polite but dismissive gesture. "Can we get her moved to the background? We're setting up for a wide establishing shot, and we need clean sight lines for the equipment." "Showcase." Becca stepped back without a word. She folded her map carefully and tucked it under her arm, keeping her clipboard in her other hand. Her face remained unreadable as she turned toward the far end of the airfield, where her faded seaplane sat. Alone, no ground crew, no media attention. no corporate logos gleaming in the morning sun. Behind her, the briefing resumed its confident rhythm. New calls were issued, timelines adjusted with military precision. The turboprop engines began their startup sequence, building from a low hum to a sharp mechanical crescendo that echoed across the concrete. Ground crew members signaled with bright orange wands. Someone cheered when the first aircraft lifted off, its shadow sliding across the hangars before disappearing into the cloudy sky. But as Becca walked toward her forgotten corner of the airfield, she carried something the others didn't have. 15 years of flying these routes in every kind of weather, a father's lessons about reading storms without instruments, and a hand-drawn map that showed exactly where the official charts were wrong. She reached her seaplane and rested her palm against its warm metal hull. The number 133 was stenciled in fading block letters across the tail. The same number from a photograph tucked inside her father's old logbook, taken decades ago when this plane was young and the world still trusted pilots who flew by instinct instead of algorithms. Above the noise of departing aircraft and confident voices, no one noticed her quiet preparations. But Becca knew something they didn't. When the fancy equipment failed and the perfect plans crumbled, someone would still need to fly into that storm, and she'd be ready. The abandoned hangar at the edge of Riverside Emergency Airfield told its own story through rust stains and patched concrete. Becca Torres pushed open the creaking door and stepped into the familiar shadows, breathing in the scent of old fuel, weathered canvas, and decades of quiet determination. This had been her sanctuary for 8 years, ever since Colonel Brennan decided her unconventional methods didn't fit the airfield's new professional image. Sunlight filtered through gaps in the corrugated walls, illuminating her seaplane like a spotlight on forgotten history. The aircraft bore the scars of countless missions, salt streaks along the hull, scratches on the pontoons that hadn't been buffed out in years, patches of paint that had surrendered to time and weather. But every rivet held firm, every system functioned, and every flight had ended with lives saved. On the far wall hung a single photograph, her father's plane, this same aircraft caught in grainy, black and white above a river bent 30 years ago. Lieutenant Colonel James Torres had flown rescue missions in places that didn't appear on official maps, bringing medical supplies to villages cut off by floods, earthquakes, and bureaucratic indifference. He'd taught Becca that flying wasn't about following orders, it was about getting people home. "The plane will tell you what it needs," he used to say, running his hand along the wing struts the same way she did now. "But you have to listen with more than your ears." Becca began her pre-flight ritual, wiping down each surface with the methodical care of someone who understood that attention to detail meant the difference between success and disaster. She checked the pontoon tie-downs, tested the cargo bay straps, and ran her fingers along the hull joints, feeling for any softness that might indicate structural fatigue. The plane responded to her touch like an old friend, solid, reliable, ready. The emergency supplies waited in weathered wooden crates beside the hangar door. Water purification tablets, antibiotics, emergency rations, and solar-powered radios. No corporate sponsorship, no media-friendly packaging, just practical help for people who needed it. Becca had purchased everything herself over the years, setting aside money from her part-time mechanic work and the occasional charter flight for researchers who didn't mind flying in an antique. As she loaded the crates into the cargo bay, securing each one with doubled straps and cushioning foam, her radio crackled to life. The voices from the main operations tent carried across the frequency confident, professional, completely unaware that their morning was about to unravel. "Tower, this is Falcon Lead. We're encountering severe wind shear at grid reference Echo 7. Visibility dropping fast. Request permission to abort approach." "Copy, Falcon Lead. Abort approved. Return to base." Becca paused in her loading, listening as the pattern repeated. One by one, the high-tech aircraft were turning back, their advanced systems no match for the brutal reality of storm-driven weather and unpredictable terrain. She'd seen it before. Pilots trained on simulators and GPS navigation, helpless when their instruments couldn't interpret what their eyes were telling them. She pulled out her father's old map, now annotated with her own observations from years of flying these routes. Every pencil mark represented a lesson learned in real weather, over real terrain, carrying real people who needed help. The official charts showed the coastline as it had been before the storms. Her map showed where it actually was. The radio chatter grew more frustrated as the morning wore on. Negative on visual approach. Too much crosswind for safe landing. Equipment malfunction in the navigation system. Becca checked her manual compass, tested the backup altimeter, and verified that her emergency beacon was functioning. Her instruments were older than most of the pilots trying to reach the flood zone, but they'd never let her down. Sometimes the simplest tools were the most reliable. Through the hangar's open door, she could see activity around the main operations. Tent people moving with the jerky urgency of plans falling apart. But here in her quiet corner of the airfield, surrounded by the honest wear of hard-used equipment and the memory of her father's steady hands, everything felt clear and purposeful. She wasn't on anyone's roster. She hadn't been assigned to any mission. But the storms were clearing to the south. Her aircraft was loaded with supplies, and somewhere in the flood zone, people were waiting for help that might never come through official channels. Becca climbed into the cockpit and began her startup sequence, feeling the familiar vibration as the propeller caught and settled into its rhythm. She didn't request clearance from the tower. They'd only tell her to stand down. She didn't announce her intentions over the radio. They'd only try to stop her. Instead, she taxied toward the secondary runway, the one the official aircraft never used because it wasn't equipped with the latest guidance systems. It was just a strip of concrete that pointed toward the storm, toward the people who needed help, toward the place where good intentions would have to be enough. As she lined up for takeoff, Becca caught a glimpse of movement near the operations tent. Someone was watching her, a young technician she didn't recognize, holding a clipboard and staring with obvious curiosity. She raised her hand in a brief salute, not knowing if he understood what he was witnessing. Then she pushed the throttle forward and lifted into the gray morning sky, carrying her father's lessons, her own hard-won experience, and the quiet certainty that some jobs required more than fancy equipment and perfect planning. They required someone willing to fly into the storm. At 1100 hours, the operations tent at Riverside Emergency Airfield had transformed from confident efficiency into barely controlled chaos. Colonel Marcus Brennan stood rigid behind the communications console, his jaw clenched as another voice crackled through the static. "Mace, this is Echo Flight. We're declaring emergency return. Repeat, emergency return. Navigation systems compromised, and we're burning fuel fast in these headwinds. Copy. Echo Flight. You're cleared for immediate landing." That made 6 aircraft turn back. 6 state-of-the-art flying machines with their corporate sponsors and media crews, all defeated by weather that Becca Torres had been reading like a book for 15 years. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the tent, though nobody was brave enough to say it out loud. Derek Manning burst through the tent flap, his perfect confidence finally cracked. His flight suit was soaked with sweat, and his hands shook slightly as he threw his headset onto the nearest crate. "The wind shear is impossible," he announced to no one in particular. "Dropped us 300 feet in 2 seconds. My co-pilot nearly lost his breakfast all over the media equipment. Brennan didn't look up from the status board, where red X marks were accumulating next to call signs like tombstones. What about the southern approach? Blocked by the storm cell. The whole corridor is socked in with visibility near zero. Even if we could navigate it, There's nowhere to land safely. The intelligence was wrong. That village is completely underwater. A junior officer cleared his throat nervously. Sir, we're getting pressure from the NGO coordinators. They promised the donors that supplies would be delivered today. The media package was supposed to show successful humanitarian aid in action. And what do you suggest I tell them? Brennan's voice carried a dangerous edge. That our million-dollar aircraft can't handle a little rough weather? In the uncomfortable silence that followed, a communications technician raised his hand tentatively. Sir, there's something you should see. We're picking up an aircraft transponder in the target zone. Every head in the tent turned toward the tech station. On the screen, a single blip moved steadily across the weather map, not retreating from the storm, but flying straight into its heart. Identification? Brennan demanded. The technician's fingers danced across his keyboard, pulling up registration data. Tail number 133. Single-engine seaplane. Registry shows Rebecca Torres, private owner. The name hung in the air like an accusation. Derek's face went pale. That's impossible. She wasn't cleared for flight. Oh, that rust bucket shouldn't even be airworthy. She's not responding to radio calls, the technician continued. But her transponder is broadcasting clear. Current heading puts her directly over the flood zone. Brennan stared at the screen for a long moment, watching the lone blip navigate through weather conditions that had turned back his entire fleet. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. Get me a connection to the village emergency coordinator. I want confirmation of what's actually happening down there. Sir, communications are still down. The storm knocked out most of the infrastructure. Then get me a satellite feed. Real-time imagery. I want to see what's happening in that zone. As the technician scrambled to establish the connection, Derek paced behind them like a caged animal. She's going to get herself killed, he muttered. Flying an ancient aircraft with no backup, no support, no proper navigation equipment. It's reckless. Is it? The question came from Lieutenant Sarah Rodriguez, a quiet logistics officer who rarely spoke up in briefings. Or is it exactly what we should have been doing all along? Derek whirled on her. What's that supposed to mean? I mean, maybe we've been so focused on looking professional that we forgot about being effective. That woman has been flying these routes longer than any of us. She knows the terrain, she knows the weather patterns, and she obviously knows something. We don't. She's not following protocol. Protocol? Rodriguez's voice rose slightly. Protocol is what grounded our entire operation while people are still waiting for help. Maybe it's time we admitted that sometimes experience matters more than equipment. Brennan held up a hand for silence, his eyes still fixed on the radar screen. The blip marked 133 was moving steadily through the worst of the storm, maintaining course and altitude with a precision that his sophisticated aircraft hadn't been able to match. Sir, the communications technician called out. I'm getting intermittent signals from the emergency beacon network in the flood zone. It looks like ... yes. Confirmed. Someone is making supply drops, multiple locations. The tent fell silent, except for the hum of electronics and the distant rumble of thunder. On the screen, that single aircraft continued its methodical progress, through conditions that had defeated every other pilot who tried. Brennan thought about his morning briefing, about the hand-drawn map he'd dismissed, about the quiet woman who tried to share local knowledge with his team of specialists. She'd stood there with decades of experience reduced to pencil marks on paper, and he'd chosen to trust computers over instinct. Now she was out there alone, doing the job his entire operation had failed to accomplish. Sir? The technician's voice was hesitant. What should I log in the official report? Brennan stared at the screen for another long moment, watching aircraft 133 disappear into the worst part of the storm. When he answered, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Log it as under review." Because sometimes the most important flights were the ones that nobody authorized. And the most effective pilots were the ones who flew not for glory or media coverage, but because people needed help, and they were the only ones willing to provide it. At 2,000 feet above the flooded coast, Becca Torres had entered a world that existed beyond the reach of satellites and weather services. Her seaplane cut through sheets of rain so thick they turned the landscape below into an impressionist, painting all blurred lines and shifting colors that required interpretation rather than simple observation. The official charts would have shown her flying over solid ground. Reality painted a different picture, an inland sea stretching for miles, dotted with the skeletal remains of trees and the geometric outlines of submerged buildings. This was the new geography created by 3 weeks of unprecedented storms. And Becca was reading it the way her father had taught her, with her eyes, her instincts, and the kind of knowledge that came from flying the same routes until they became part of her muscle memory. A radio crackled with desperate chatter from the operations center. "Any aircraft in the vicinity of Grid Echo 7, please respond. We have lost contact with all assets in the flood zone, requesting immediate status update." She reached over and turned the volume down. Their grid references were useless out here, where the landmarks they'd been based on were 20 feet underwater. But she had her own navigation system, the bend in the river that created a distinctive oxbow pattern, the cluster of grain silos that still rose above the flood line like concrete lighthouses, the way the current flowed around the submerged highway overpass. Her first target came into view through the rain. A small community center where the roof peaked above the waterline like an island. She could see the blue tarp stretched between the radio antenna and a nearby tree, the signal her father had taught local emergency coordinators to use decades ago when official communication systems failed. Becca banked into her approach, feeling the aircraft respond to every subtle adjustment of the controls. No GPS guidance, no ground control instructions, just the relationship between pilot and machine that came from years of flying together through every kind of weather. She lined up with the building, judging the wind speed by how the tarp was moving, estimating the water depth by the angle of the partially submerged fence posts. The supply drop was perfect. A waterproof container filled with antibiotics and water purification tablets landed squarely on the flat section of roof, cushioned by old tires that someone had positioned exactly where they needed to be. As she climbed away from the drop zone, she caught a glimpse of faces at the upper windows. 3 adults and what looked like 2 children, waving frantically. She keyed her radio briefly. Package delivered. Community Center Alpha. Medical. Supplies and water treatment. More to follow. No response from the operations center, but she hadn't expected one. They were still trying to figure out why their sophisticated aircraft couldn't navigate conditions that she was handling with equipment older than most of the pilots in their briefing room. Her second target was trickier, a residential area where several houses had become temporary islands, connected by improvised bridges made from scavenged lumber. She could see people moving between the structures, and the distinctive orange panels that meant they had injured residents needing evacuation. But this drop would require precision landing on water that was barely deep enough for her pontoons, with debris floating just below the surface that could damage her aircraft if she miscalculated. It was exactly the kind of operation that military flight manuals would classify as inadvisable under current conditions. Becca smiled grimly and began her descent. The water landing felt like threading a needle in a hurricane. She touched down between a submerged car and the twisted remains of a swing set, using the resistance of the water to slow her approach while keeping enough speed to maintain control. Her pontoons carved parallel wakes through the muddy water. As she taxied toward the makeshift dock, an elderly man waited at the water's edge, up to his waist in the flood but steady on his feet. Behind him, a woman helped support someone who was clearly injured, wrapped in makeshift bandages and moving with the careful stiffness of someone fighting pain. "Are you the pilot they called for?" the man shouted over the sound of her idling. "Propeller." "I'm the pilot who came," Becca replied, which was all the answer that mattered. The injured person turned out to be a teenager with a badly infected leg wound, the kind of injury that would become life-threatening without proper medical attention. Becca helped them into her aircraft, settling them in the passenger compartment. With emergency blankets and the basic first aid supplies she always carried. "Where's the nearest hospital that's still operating?" she asked the elderly man. "St. Mary's in Riverside is taking emergency cases, but that's 40 miles through the storm, 40 miles is nothing," Becca said, already calculating the flight path in her head. "Tell everyone to keep those orange panels visible. I'll be back with more supplies as soon as I can." As she taxied away from the improvised dock, preparing for takeoff, a radio crackled with a familiar voice. "Aircraft 133. This is Riverside Operations. You are ordered to return to base immediately. You are flying without authorization in hazardous conditions." Becca looked back at the teenager in a passenger compartment, pale but breathing steadily, trusting her to navigate them safely through the storm to medical care that could save their life. She keyed the radio one more time. "Negative. Operations. I have wounded on board and a mission to complete. 133 out." Then she turned the radio off entirely and focused on what she did best: flying by instinct, experience, and the quiet certainty that some things were more important than following orders. By 1500 hours, the operations tent at Riverside Emergency Airfield had become a study in barely controlled panic. Colonel Marcus Brennan stood before a wall of monitors displaying real-time feeds from 3 different news networks, all running variations of the same headline: "Mystery pilot succeeds where military operation fails." The footage was grainy, but unmistakable. Becca Torres's seaplane landing in flooded streets, loading evacuees, making supply drops with surgical precision, while million-dollar aircraft sat grounded by weather that she seemed to navigate effortlessly. Someone with a cell phone had captured her aircraft skimming just above the floodwaters, and the video was already being shared thousands of times across social media. How did this get out? Brennan demanded, though he already knew the answer. In an age of smartphones and satellite internet, there were no such things as unobserved operations, especially when the only successful rescue efforts were being conducted by a pilot who wasn't supposed to be flying at all. Derek Manning sat, slumped in a folding chair, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. The press crew is asking questions. They want to know why their expensive ride couldn't accomplish what some bush pilot is doing in a museum piece. Lieutenant Rodriguez pulled up another feed on her tablet. "It gets worse, sir." The humanitarian organizations are starting to ask pointed questions about resource allocation. They're wondering why we spend millions on equipment that can't handle the conditions, while the actual rescue work is being done by someone operating on her own dime. The tent flap rustled, and communications specialist Jake Morrison entered with a satellite phone in his hand. His face was pale. "Sir, I've got the regional emergency coordinator on the line. He wants to speak with whoever's in charge of the operation." Brennan took the phone with the enthusiasm of someone picking up a live grenade. Colonel Brennan speaking. The voice on the other end was crisp and professional, with an undertone of barely contained frustration. "Colonel, I'm looking at reports that suggest your operation has been less than successful today. Meanwhile, we have confirmation of multiple civilian rescues and supply deliveries being conducted by an unaffiliated aircraft. Can you explain this discrepancy?" "Sir, we encountered severe weather conditions that made safe operations impossible for our equipment. We followed proper safety protocols, Colonel. The voice cut him off with surgical precision. While you were following protocols, 17 people have been evacuated from life-threatening situations by a pilot who apparently doesn't require million-dollar navigation systems to do her job. I'm told she's made 6 successful landings in conditions her aircraft couldn't handle. Brennan felt something cold settling in his stomach. Sir, the pilot in question is operating without authorization. She's not following established safety procedures, and yet she's the only one getting results. Tell me, Colonel, what exactly do we pay you and your team to accomplish? The question hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. Around the tent, conversations had stopped. Even Derek had looked up from his chair, his face reflecting the dawning realization that someone was going to be held accountable for this disaster. Sir, if I could explain the circumstances. The circumstances, Colonel, are that people were dying while your sophisticated operation was grounded by weather. The circumstances are that the only effective response came from someone your team apparently dismissed as irrelevant. The circumstances are that we now have video footage of your failure being broadcast on national television. Brennan closed his eyes. What are your instructions, sir? Find out who this pilot is. Find out how she's accomplishing what your entire operation couldn't. And find out why nobody in your chain of command thought to utilize her expertise when lives were on the line. The line went dead. Brennan handed the phone back to Morrison and looked around the tent at his assembled team. The expensive equipment, the corporate sponsors, the media credentials, all of it suddenly felt like elaborate decorations on a fundamentally hollow operation. Sir? Rodriguez's voice was careful. What do we do now? Before Brennan could answer, the radio crackled to life. Riverside Operations. This is Torres, in Aircraft 133. I have 4 more evacuees inbound to St. Mary's Hospital. 15 minutes. Be advised, I'm making 2 more supply runs before end of daylight. Suggest you have your ground teams ready to assist with logistics. The voice was calm, professional, completely matter-of-fact. No drama, no grandstanding, just a pilot doing her job with the kind of competence that made everyone else in the tent feel like amateurs. Derek slammed his hand down on the table. She's making us look like idiots. No, said Lieutenant Rodriguez quietly. She's making us look like what we are. People who prioritized image over effectiveness, equipment over experience, and bureaucracy over getting the job done. Brennan stared at the radio for a long moment, listening to the static that filled the space between transmissions. Somewhere out there, flying through conditions that had defeated his entire operation, was a pilot who understood something fundamental that he'd forgotten. The mission was supposed to be about helping people, not looking good while you tried. Morrison, he said finally, get me everything we have on Rebecca Torres. Flight records, certifications, previous operations, everything. Yes, sir. And get me a direct line to her aircraft. It's time we had a conversation. Because if there was any chance of salvaging this operation and his career, it was going to require learning from someone who had never forgotten what flying was really supposed to accomplish. The satellite phone in Colonel Brennan's hand felt heavier than it should have as he waited for Becca Torres to respond to his transmission. Around him, the operations tent had gone completely silent. 24 people holding their breath while their commanding officer prepared to have the most important conversation of his military career. Aircraft 133, this is Colonel Brennan. At Riverside Operations, please respond. Static filled the airwaves for nearly 30 seconds before Becca's voice came through, calm and unhurried, despite the storm conditions she was flying through. Go ahead, Operations. Ms. Torres, I need to ask you some questions about your current activities. I'm conducting humanitarian rescue operations in the flood zone. Is there something specific you need to know? The directness of her response caught Brennan off guard. No defensiveness. No excuses. Just a simple statement of purpose that highlighted how far his own operation had strayed from its original mission. You're operating without official authorization in hazardous conditions, Colonel. Her voice carried the kind of patient authority that came from years of dealing with bureaucrats who confused paperwork with performance. I've made 14 successful landings today. I've evacuated 23 people from life-threatening situations. I've delivered critical medical supplies to 7 different locations. Your authorization or lack thereof hasn't saved a single life or delivered a single aspirin. Around the tent, Brennan could see his team members exchanging glances. Lieutenant Rodriguez was taking notes, her expression thoughtful rather than critical. Even Derek had stopped slouching in his chair, listening with the attention of someone finally hearing hard truths. How are you navigating the conditions that grounded our aircraft? Brennan asked, genuinely curious now rather than confrontational. The same way my father navigated them 30 years ago, and his instructors navigated them 30 years before that. You read the water, you read the wind, you read the terrain. You don't rely on instruments that can fail, or satellites that can't see through storm clouds. Morrison leaned toward his radio equipment and whispered something to the technician beside him. A moment later, he handed Brennan a folder marked with official stamps and security classifications. Ms. Torres, Brennan continued, I have your service record here. Lieutenant Colonel James Torres, Silver Star recipient, over 200 combat rescue missions in Southeast Asia. Medal of Honor recommendation for operations behind enemy lines. My father was a good pilot. It says here, he trained local pilots in unconventional rescue techniques, developed protocols for operations in areas with no ground support, no satellite navigation, no official backup. He understood that helping people was more important than following regulations. Brennan opened the folder wider, scanning through pages of commendations and incident reports. It also says you were his student, that you logged over 500 hours as co-pilot on humanitarian missions before his death, that you maintained his aircraft and his operational knowledge. Is there a question in there somewhere, Colonel? The bluntness of the response drew chuckles from several people in the tent. The kind of nervous laughter that comes when someone finally says what everyone is thinking. The question, Brennan said slowly, is why we didn't know about your capabilities when we were planning this operation. The silence that followed stretched long enough for lightning to flash twice outside the tent. When Becca finally responded, her voice carried a weight that made everyone lean forward to listen. You did know, Colonel. I attended every planning meeting for 3 months. I offered local terrain knowledge, weather pattern analysis, and operational advice based on 15 years of flying these routes. I was told my input wasn't needed because you had modern resources and proper procedures. Brennan felt something sink in his chest. He remembered the meetings, remembered the quiet woman with the hand-drawn maps, who never seemed to fit with his vision of a sleek, media-ready operation. I submitted detailed reports about changed coastlines, shifted drainage patterns, and the locations of emergency supplies pre-positioned throughout the region. Those reports were filed under local liaison materials and ignored. Lieutenant Rodriguez looked up from her notes. Sir, she's right. I remember seeing those reports. They were classified as supplementary information. Supplementary? Becca's voice carried a bitter edge now. Knowing where people can actually land safely is supplementary. Understanding which routes are passable and which are death traps is supplementary. Derek shifted uncomfortably in his chair. We had GPS mapping and satellite intelligence. You had pictures of how things used to look, Becca interrupted. I had knowledge of how things actually are. But your pictures have better graphics, so you went with those. The truth of it hit the tent like a physical blow. Brennan looked around at his assembled team, brilliant, well-trained, equipped with the latest technology, and realized they had systematically excluded the one person who actually understood the mission environment. "Aircraft 133, he said quietly. "What do you need from us to continue operations?" "I need you to stop trying to recall me for unauthorized flight activity. I need your ground teams to coordinate with the hospital for incoming evacuees. And I need you to understand that when this is over, we're going to have a serious conversation about how you plan operations." "Understood. Is there anything else?" "Yes, Colonel. There are still people out there who need help. While we've been talking, I could have made another supply run. So unless you have something constructive to contribute, I suggest you let me get back to work." The transmission ended, leaving the tent in complete silence. Brennan closed the folder and looked around at his team. They'd spent months planning an operation that had failed in its first 4 hours, while a pilot they dismissed as irrelevant was accomplishing everything they'd set out to do. "Questions?" he asked. "Just one," said Lieutenant Rodriguez. "When this is over, do we still have jobs?" Brennan considered the question seriously. "That," he said, "is going to depend on how much we can learn from someone who's been trying to teach us all along." Outside, thunder rolled across the airfield, but for the first time all day, it sounded less like a threat and more like applause. The media briefing room at Riverside Emergency Airfield had been hastily converted from a storage facility, still smelling of cardboard and industrial cleaning supplies. But by 1800 hours, it was packed with reporters, humanitarian organization representatives, and military officials who had arrived from the regional command center with expressions that promised serious consequences for someone. Colonel Marcus Brennan stood at the makeshift podium, acutely aware that his career was balanced on a knife's edge. Behind him, a large screen displayed the day's statistics: 0 successful official rescue operations, 6 aircraft grounded by weather, 1 unauthorized pilot responsible for 31 evacuations and supply deliveries to 12 locations. The numbers told a story that no amount of military jargon could obscure. "Ladies and gentlemen," Brennan began, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to do, "I want to address the operational discrepancies that occurred during today's humanitarian mission." A reporter from CNN raised her hand. Immediately, "Colonel, can you explain how a single unauthorized aircraft accomplished more in one day than your entire $1 million operation?" Brennan had prepared for this question, but hearing it spoken aloud still felt like a physical blow. The pilot in question, Rebecca Torres, possesses specialized local knowledge and experience that our planning process failed to adequately incorporate. Failed to incorporate? The reporter's follow-up was sharp. "According to our sources, Ms. Torres attended planning meetings for months and was systematically excluded from operational decisions. Is that accurate?" Before Brennan could respond, the briefing room door opened with enough force to rattle the temporary hinges. Becca Torres entered, still wearing her flight suit, her hair damp from the rain and her boots leaving wet prints on the concrete floor. She looked like she'd just stepped out of a war movie, tired, focused, and completely unimpressed by the assembled authority figures. "Don't answer that," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the room despite its conversational tone. "I'll answer it myself." The room erupted in camera clicks and shouted questions, but Becca simply walked to the front and stood beside the podium, not behind it. She faced the crowd with the same calm confidence she'd shown while flying through the storm. "My name is Rebecca Torres. I've been flying humanitarian missions in this region for 15 years. Today, I conducted 31 successful rescue operations while the official response team sat grounded by weather conditions I navigate routinely." A reporter from the Washington Post leaned forward. "Ms. Torres, were you officially authorized for today's flights?" "No. I was specifically told that my services weren't needed because they had Modern resources. She glanced at Brennan with an expression that wasn't quite hostile, but carried the weight of years of frustration. Those modern resources failed completely. Derek Manning, who had been sitting in the back row looking increasingly uncomfortable, finally stood up. That's not fair. The weather conditions were extreme. Our equipment has safety protocols. Your equipment, Becca interrupted, turning to face him directly, has safety protocols designed by people who've never flown in actual emergency conditions. Your protocols prioritize avoiding risk over accepting the necessary dangers of saving lives. We follow established procedures. You follow procedures that assume perfect conditions and unlimited backup support. When those conditions don't exist, your procedures become excuses for inaction. The room had gone completely silent except for the rapid clicking of cameras. This wasn't a prepared statement or a carefully managed crisis response. This was a real-time dismantling of everything. The official operation represented. A representative from Doctors Without Borders raised his hand. Ms. Torres, what would you have done differently if you'd been in charge of today's operation? I would have used the terrain knowledge I've been offering for months. I would have positioned aircraft based on actual conditions rather than theoretical flight plans. I would have prioritized getting help to people over getting good footage for publicity materials. Her eyes swept across the room, landing on each of the military officials who had dismissed her expertise. Most importantly, I would have remembered that the mission is supposed to be about humanitarian aid, not showcasing expensive equipment. Colonel Brennan felt the weight of every decision he'd made over the past month settling on his shoulders, like a physical burden. He thought about the planning meetings where he'd politely filed away Becca's reports, the briefings where he'd focused on media impact over operational effectiveness, the moment this morning when he'd chosen corporate sponsors over local expertise. Ms. Torres, he said quietly, you're absolutely right. The admission rippled through the room like an electric shock. Military officers didn't typically acknowledge fundamental failures in front of rolling cameras and international media. Our planning process was flawed, Brennan continued, his voice growing stronger. We prioritized appearance over effectiveness, technology over experience, and bureaucratic approval over mission accomplishment. The result was operational failure. While people needed help, Becca studied his face for a moment, as if evaluating the sincerity of his words. The result, she said finally, was that people who should have been rescued hours ago had to wait while you figured out that you're expensive. Toys don't work in bad weather. What do you recommend we do going forward? The question hung in the air while Becca considered her response. Around the room, reporters leaned forward, sensing that they were witnessing something more significant than a typical military briefing. I recommend, she said slowly, that you start by understanding the difference between managing a crisis and solving one. Managing a crisis is about controlling the narrative and minimizing blame. Solving a crisis is about using whatever resources and knowledge are available to help people, regardless of whether those resources fit your organizational chart. A reporter from NPR asked, "Are you saying the military approach is fundamentally wrong?" I'm saying that any approach that values procedure over performance will fail when lives are on the line. Today proved that the most sophisticated equipment in the world is useless if you don't understand the environment you're operating in. Derek shifted uncomfortably. So what, we should just ignore safety protocols and fly into dangerous conditions? Becca's smile was thin, but not without sympathy. Captain, the difference between dangerous and impossible is experience. What do you call dangerous? I call Tuesday. But you can't learn the difference from a manual or a simulator. You learn it by flying in real weather, over real terrain, carrying real people who need your help. She turned back to the assembled crowd. The question isn't whether we should take risks. The question is whether we're willing to accept the risks necessary to save lives. or whether we're more concerned with avoiding the risks that might make us look bad on television. The room erupted in shouted questions, but Becca was already walking toward the door. At the threshold, she paused and looked back at Colonel Brennan. "Colonel, when you're ready to plan operations based on effectiveness rather than optics, you know where to find me. Until then, I'll be doing what I've always done, flying when people need help, regardless of whether anyone gives me permission." And with that, she was gone, leaving behind a room full of officials who suddenly understood that they'd been measuring success by all the wrong metrics. 3 weeks later, Rebecca Torres sat in her weathered office at the edge of Riverside Emergency Airfield, reading through a stack of official documents that would have seemed impossible a month ago. The morning sun streamed through windows she'd finally had time to clean, illuminating letters of commendation, congressional hearing transcripts, and a formal request from the National Guard to serve as senior advisor for humanitarian operations. The phone on her desk rang with the insistent tone of official business. She glanced at the caller ID and smiled before answering. "Torres Aviation." "Miss Torres, this is General Patricia Hendricks from Regional Command. I wanted to personally thank you for your testimony before the Congressional Subcommittee last week. Just telling the truth, General. Your truth resulted in a complete overhaul of our emergency response protocols and a $50 million BUDGET reallocation toward practical rescue capabilities. That's more than telling the truth. That's changing how we think about crisis." Response. Through her office window, Becca could see activity around the main hangars. New aircraft were arriving, not the sleek, media-friendly jets that had failed so spectacularly, but rugged, practical machines designed for real-world rescue operations. More importantly, she could see pilots studying hand-drawn maps and taking notes from local coordinators who actually understood the terrain. "What happened to Colonel Brennan?" she asked. "Reassigned to a training position where he can't do any more damage. But interestingly, he requested the assignment. Said he needed to learn how to train officers who prioritize mission accomplishment over career advancement. And Captain Manning? Civilian instructor now, teaching flight safety at a commercial aviation school. Apparently, getting shown up by a bush pilot was exactly the ego adjustment he needed." Becca chuckled. Sometimes the best thing that can happen to someone is having their assumptions challenged by reality. Speaking of which, I have a proposition for you. We're establishing a new rapid response unit, small, flexible, staffed by pilots who can operate in adverse conditions without extensive support systems. We'd like you to head the training program. The offer hung in the air while Becca considered it. She thought about her father, who had taught her that flying was about service, not status. She thought about the villages where people still sent her handwritten thank you notes, and the young pilots who were finally learning that technology was a tool, not a substitute for skill and judgment. "What kind of authority would I have?" "Complete operational control. You'd select the pilots, design the training curriculum, and establish protocols based on practical effectiveness rather than bureaucratic approval. No committees, no corporate sponsors, no media management, just results." Becca looked at the photograph on her desk. Her father standing beside aircraft 133 years ago, young and confident and dedicated to the idea that some jobs were too important to be left to bureaucrats. The plane in the photo looked almost new then. Now it sat in the hangar behind her office, scarred by decades of real work, but still ready to fly when people needed help. "I accept," she said, "but I have conditions." "Name them." "First, we recruit from bush pilots, crop dusters and air. Ambulance services, people who know how to fly in real conditions, not just perfect ones. Second, all training happens in actual weather, over actual terrain, with actual emergency scenarios. No simulators, no theoretical exercises. Agreed? What else?" We maintain aircraft based on reliability, not appearance. And we never ever ground an operation because the conditions don't match what's in the manual. General Hendricks was quiet for a moment. Miss Torres, what you're describing sounds more like organized chaos than military procedure. General, what I'm describing is exactly how emergency response should work. Organized around the emergency, not around the organization. 2 hours later, Becca stood in the main briefing room at Riverside Emergency Airfield, facing a group of 20 pilots who had been selected not for their credentials or their corporate connections, but for their ability to fly when flying was difficult and land when landing was dangerous. Among them was Jake Morrison, the young communications specialist who had watched her take off that first morning and had requested transfer to flight training. Beside him sat Captain Lisa Rodriguez-Serres, younger sister, a helicopter pilot who had spent 3 years flying medical evacuations in the mountains of Afghanistan. Ladies and gentlemen, Becca began, you're here because someone thinks you might have what it takes to save lives when the equipment fails. The weather turns dangerous, and the textbook solutions don't apply. She gestured toward the window, where aircraft 133 sat in its usual spot, ready for its next mission. That plane has been flying humanitarian operations for 30 years. It's never been featured in a magazine, never won an innovation award, and never impressed anyone who values form over function. But it saved over 400 lives because the people who fly it understand one simple truth. The mission is more important than the machine. A young pilot in the front row raised his hand. Ma'am, what's the most important thing we need to learn? Becca smiled, remembering her father asking her the same question when she was barely old enough to see. Over the instrument panel, the most important thing you need to learn is that flying isn't about conquering the weather or overpowering the terrain. It's about working with conditions as they actually exist, not as you wish they were. She walked over to the map board, where hand-drawn charts covered every inch of available space local knowledge accumulated over decades of real operations. These maps weren't made by satellites or surveying teams. They were made by pilots who flew low enough to see how the rivers actually flow, where the power lines really run, and which fields are soft enough to land on when you don't have any other choice. What about the high-tech equipment? Asked another pilot. Technology is a tool, Becca replied. A very useful tool when it works, and a dangerous distraction when it doesn't. But the most sophisticated GPS in the world can't tell you which way the wind is shifting, or how the light looks through a storm cloud. Those are things you learn by flying, not by reading manuals. She looked around the room at faces that reminded her of her own pilots from years past, serious, dedicated, and willing to accept the risks that came with taking responsibility for other people's lives. Over the next 6 months, you're going to learn how to fly when the conditions are terrible, land when there's no proper runway, and navigate when your instruments are dead. You're going to discover that the most important equipment you carry is between your ears, and the most reliable backup system is your own experience. Morrison raised his hand. Ma'am, what happens if we make mistakes? You'll make mistakes, Becca said matter-of-factly. Everyone does. The question is whether you make them during training, where we can learn from them, or during real operations, where people die because of them. She walked back to the front of the room and stood beside a podium that she didn't need. Her father had taught her that the best lessons were delivered standing among the students, not speaking down to them from authority. The previous emergency response program failed because it confused looking professional with being effective. We're going to do the opposite. We're going to look like exactly what we are. Pilots who are more concerned with getting the job done than getting the credit. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance. Not the sound of approaching danger, but the promise of another chance to prove that skill and determination could overcome any obstacle. In a few hours, some of these pilots would be flying their first training missions in conditions that would have grounded the entire previous operation. And in a few months, when the next crisis came, they would be ready to do what Becca had always done: fly into the storm when everyone else stayed on the ground, because that's where the people who needed help were waiting. The mission, after all, was still more important than the machine. 6 months later, when Hurricane Patricia devastated the Gulf Coast, the newly trained Rapid Response Unit completed over 200 successful rescue operations in conditions that meteorologists classified as unsurvivable for aircraft operations. The mission reports noted only that all operations were completed without incident, using techniques that prioritize practical effectiveness over procedural compliance. Rebecca Torres was posthumously awarded the Congressional Gold Medal 3 years later, after her aircraft was lost during a rescue operation in the mountains of Nepal. The citation read simply, "For demonstrating that the measure of a pilot is not the sophistication of their equipment, but their willingness to fly when people need help." Aircraft 133 still sits in the hangar at Riverside Emergency Airfield, maintained by pilots who understand that some machines become more than the sum of their parts when they're operated by people who remember why flying matters. If you enjoyed this story about Rebecca Torres and her quiet triumph over bureaucratic incompetence, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. We share real stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things when it matters most. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world. Have you ever witnessed someone with real expertise being overlooked by people in authority? Share your story in the comments. Thanks for being part of our community. And remember, sometimes the most important work gets done by people who care more about results than recognition.